Look, I need to get this off my chest because what happened 6 months ago completely changed how I see my family. And honestly, I'm still processing the whole mess. I'm 26, and up until this disaster, I'd been living at home while working remote for a tech company. Not ideal, but I was saving money and helping my parents, Franklin and Patricia, with their mortgage payments. Yeah, you read that right. I was covering about 60% of their monthly house payment plus utilities because dad's disability check and mom's part-time retail job weren't cutting it. My brother William, who's 28, lives there too but contributes exactly $0 because he's between opportunities and has been for 3 years running. The arrangement worked for everyone, or so I thought. I had my own space in the finished basement, kept to myself mostly, and felt good about helping family. My parents seemed grateful, always talking about how responsible I was compared to William, how they could count on me. Classic golden child treatment, right? Then I got laid off. The company I worked for got bought out and they eliminated my entire department. Happens all the time in tech, nothing personal. Decent severance package, whatever. I came upstairs that Tuesday morning to break the news, figuring we'd figure out a temporary plan together since, family. Franklin was in his recliner watching some morning talk show when I told him. He just stared at me for like 10 seconds, then his face went completely red. Patricia came out of the kitchen and I repeated the news. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Franklin stood up and started yelling about how I was irresponsible. How could I let this happen? What was I going to do now? I tried explaining that layoffs aren't exactly something you control, but he wasn't hearing it. Patricia jumped in talking about the mortgage payment due next week, how they were counting on me, how I better find another job immediately or figure something else out. Then William walked in from wherever he'd been hiding and the whole thing went nuclear. Franklin turned to him and said something about how at least William wasn't promising to pay bills he couldn't cover. William, who hasn't contributed a single dollar to household expenses in 3 years, suddenly became the voice of responsibility. He started lecturing me about planning ahead, about how I should have seen this coming, about how I'd been living in a fantasy if I thought my job was secure. I lost it. I pointed out that I'd been carrying this house financially for 2 years, while William played video games and occasionally filled out job applications. I reminded them that without my contributions, they would have lost the house already. I said I needed a few weeks to line up interviews and find something new, and that I had enough savings to cover my share for probably 2 months. That's when Franklin completely snapped. He grabbed my laptop off the kitchen counter and threw it across the room. The screen cracked and it bounced off the wall. Then he started screaming about how I was a useless burden who'd been leeching off them for years, how I needed to get out of his house before he beat some sense into me. The irony was completely lost on him. Patricia went straight for my wallet, which was on the counter next to where my laptop had been. She emptied it, took every bill I had, about $240, and told me this barely covered what I owed them for groceries and utilities. William, not to be outdone, went downstairs and started throwing my clothes into trash bags. He brought them up and dumped them by the front door, telling me not to even think about asking for help when I was starving on the streets. Then, and this is the part that still gets to me, they opened a bottle of champagne. Patricia had been saving it for some occasion, and apparently me getting kicked out qualified. They were literally celebrating as I loaded my stuff into my car. I spent that night in a motel trying to process what had just happened. These people who'd been calling me responsible and dependable for years had turned on me the second I lost my job through no fault of my own. The brother who'd been freeloading for 3 years was suddenly the responsible one. The parents who'd been relying on my income were acting like I'd been taking advantage of them. It took me about a week to find a temporary place and start job hunting seriously. The broken laptop was a pain, but I managed. Got a new position within 6 weeks, actually. Better pay than before. Started rebuilding my life without them. Here's the thing, though, and this is where it gets interesting. I'd been handling the mortgage payments through my bank account, direct automatic withdrawal, that I'd set up 2 years earlier when I started helping out. In all the chaos and anger of getting kicked out, nobody thought to ask about changing that arrangement. I didn't think about it either, honestly. I was focused on finding work and getting my life together. It wasn't until I was reviewing my bank statements a month later that I realized the payments were still coming out. So I called the bank and canceled the automatic transfer. The foreclosure notice went out 30 days after they missed their first payment. Apparently, Franklin and Patricia thought I'd keep paying even after they threw me out and celebrated my departure. They never bothered setting up their own payment arrangement with the bank. William called me first. He was frantic, talking about how they'd gotten this scary letter from the bank, how they needed to talk. I told him I was busy and hung up. Then Patricia called crying about how they didn't understand what was happening. Could I please call them back? They needed my help figuring this out. Franklin left a voicemail that was just him yelling about how I was vindictive and cruel, how I was destroying the family, how they'd raised me better than this. But here's what really tells you everything about these people. Not one of them apologized for how they treated me. Not one acknowledged that maybe throwing me out for losing my job was harsh. It was all about what I could do to fix their problem. The calls kept coming. William tried a different approach, talking about family loyalty and how I was better than this kind of revenge. Patricia sent long text messages about how she never meant for things to go so far, how they'd all been stressed and reacted badly, but surely I understood they were family and families stick together. Franklin's messages got increasingly angry. He accused me of planning this whole thing, of somehow orchestrating getting fired just to hurt them. Yeah, because I definitely convinced a major corporation to eliminate my department just to mess with his mortgage payments. I didn't respond to any of them. Yesterday, I drove past the old house. There's a foreclosure sign on the lawn and the driveway is empty. Looks like they finally figured out I wasn't coming to rescue them. Part of me wonders where they ended up, but honestly, they made their choice that day when they threw me out and celebrated. They chose to treat me like garbage the moment I wasn't useful to them anymore. Now they get to live with those consequences. I keep thinking about that champagne. They were so happy to be rid of me, so convinced they were better off without their burden of a son. Well, now they get to find out what life without me actually looks like. Update coming soon because this story is far from over. Update 1. Okay, so remember how I said this story was far from over? Yeah, that was an understatement. The comments on my last post were incredible, by the way. Shout out to everyone who called exactly what would happen next. You all know toxic family dynamics way too well. So where I left off, they'd just gotten the foreclosure notice and the desperate calls had started. Well, buckle up, because what happened over the next few weeks was absolutely unhinged. First, let me give you some background I didn't include before because honestly, I was still processing it all. See, this whole dynamic with my family goes way deeper than just me helping with bills. Franklin has always had this thing about being the provider, the man of the house, all that traditional stuff. When his back injury forced him onto disability 3 years ago, it completely broke something in him. He went from being this proud guy who worked construction for 20 years to someone who couldn't even lift a bag of groceries without pain. Patricia tried to pick up the slack with her retail job, but let's be real. Part-time at a department store wasn't going to cover a mortgage that Franklin had gotten during the good years when he was making decent money. That's when I stepped in, thinking I was being a good son. What I didn't realize was that every payment I made was like another reminder to Franklin that he couldn't provide for his own family anymore. William figured this out way before I did. He's actually pretty smart when it comes to reading people and situations. He just uses that intelligence to manipulate rather than, get a job. He positioned himself as the one who didn't make Franklin feel inadequate. He never offered to help financially, never brought up the mortgage or bills, just existed in this bubble where money problems weren't his concern. In Franklin's mind, William wasn't a threat to his ego. I was. That's why Franklin's reaction to me losing my job was so over the top. In his twisted logic, I'd been holding my financial contribution over his head for 2 years, making him feel small and useless. When I lost my job, it was like validation that I wasn't actually better than him, that I was just as vulnerable and unreliable as he felt. Patricia went along with it because she spent 3 years watching Franklin's self-worth crumble, and she'll do anything to make him feel like a man again, even if it means sacrificing her other son. William encouraged it because having me gone meant he was the only remaining child, the one who never disappointed Dad, never made Dad feel inadequate. Anyway, back to the current situation. After that first wave of frantic calls and voicemails, they tried a different approach. William showed up at my new apartment. I was coming home from work on a Thursday when I found him sitting on the steps outside my building, just sitting there like he belonged, scrolling through his phone. When he saw me, he stood up and started this whole speech about how we needed to talk, how the family was falling apart, how I was the only one who could fix this. I told him he had 5 minutes before I called building security. That's when he started explaining their brilliant new plan. See, they'd figured out that I'd been making the mortgage payments and they weren't even mad about me stopping them. In fact, William said, they understood completely why I'd done it and they didn't blame me at all. They'd all been stressed and said things they didn't mean. Family fights happen, right? But here's the thing. They could fix this. All of it. The foreclosure process takes months. And they'd talked to someone at the bank who said if they could bring the payments current and show proof of ongoing income, they could stop the whole thing. They had a plan to make it work. William was going to finally get serious about job hunting. Patricia was going to ask for more hours at the store, Maybe pick up a second part-time job somewhere. Franklin was looking into whether he could do some kind of light work that wouldn't affect his disability status. They were going to be a real team, all contributing. No more taking anyone for granted. And me? Well, if I could just help them get caught up on the missed payments and maybe cover things for a couple months while they got this new arrangement going, then we could all move forward as a real family. William would pay me back every dollar with interest. Franklin wanted to apologize in person for how he'd reacted. Patricia was already planning a big family dinner to celebrate everyone being back together. I asked William how much money we were talking about. He said they were 3 months behind now, so around $4,000 to get current, plus probably another $6,000 to cover the next 3 months while they got their new income streams established. $10,000 total, but like he said, they'd pay me back with interest once everyone was working. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. Here was the same brother who'd thrown my clothes in trash bags and told me I'd be starving on the streets, now asking me for $10,000 to bail out the same parents who'd emptied my wallet and celebrated my departure with champagne. William got defensive immediately. He said I was being childish, that this was bigger than whatever hurt feelings I had from one bad day. Families fight, families make up, that's how it works. He said I was being petty and vindictive, that I was punishing innocent people because my pride was hurt. I told him my pride wasn't hurt. My pride was actually doing great. Thanks for asking. What was hurt was my understanding of who these people really were. I'd learned that Franklin's love was conditional on my usefulness, that Patricia's support lasted exactly as long as I could pay bills, and that William's brotherhood extended only to what he could get from me. William tried to interrupt, but I kept going. I said they'd shown me their true feelings that day, and now they were dealing with the consequences of those feelings. If they'd spoken to me with respect, if they'd worked together on a plan when I lost my job, if they'd treated me like family instead of like a problem to be disposed of, we wouldn't be having this conversation. That's when William's nice guy act dropped and he showed me who he really was. He said I was being ridiculous, that I'd been living rent-free for 2 years while they struggled. He said I should be grateful they'd given me a place to stay, instead of acting like I'd done them some huge favor. He said the house payments were Franklin's responsibility anyway, that anything I'd contributed was just paying my fair share for living there. I pointed out that he'd been living there longer than me and hadn't paid a fair share of anything. William said that was different because he wasn't working. But I had been working, so obviously I should contribute. Now that I was working again, I should contribute again. It was that simple. I asked him what part of getting thrown out and told never to come back suggested that I should contribute to anything related to that house. William said I was taking that day too seriously, that everyone was upset and said things they didn't mean. He said Franklin had been stressed about money for years and just exploded, but that didn't mean he didn't love me or want me in the family. I asked William if he thought it was normal for parents to empty their son's wallet and celebrate his departure with champagne when he lost his job. William said I was exaggerating what happened, that they didn't actually celebrate, that I was remembering it wrong because I was hurt and angry. That's when I knew for sure that these people were never going to acknowledge what they'd done or take responsibility for their choices. In their minds, they were the victims of my vindictive reaction to a simple family disagreement. I told William that our conversation was over, that he needed to leave, and that if any of them contacted me again, I'd be documenting it as harassment. William said I'd regret this, that family was all you really had in life, and that someday when I needed help, I'd understand what I'd thrown away. I said the people who threw things away were the ones who decided a champagne celebration was the appropriate response to their son's job loss. After William left, I did something I'd been putting off. I blocked all their numbers and blocked them on every social media platform I could think of. I was done with the manipulation, done with the gaslighting, done with being treated like the villain for refusing to enable people who'd shown me exactly how much I meant to them. But wait, it gets better. Last week, Patricia showed up at my workplace. Yeah, you read that right. She somehow figured out where I worked and just appeared in our reception area, asking to speak with me. Security called my extension and said I had a visitor, a woman claiming to be my mother who seemed very upset. I went down to the lobby and there she was, looking exhausted and desperate, clutching her purse like her life depended on it. The receptionist was clearly uncomfortable. Patricia was crying and kept talking about how she just needed 5 minutes with her son to explain something important. I walked over and told her she needed to leave immediately. Patricia started this whole scene about how I couldn't even look at my own mother, how she'd raised me better than this, how she never thought I could be so cold. She said she'd been calling my old number for weeks not knowing I'd blocked her, and that she'd only found my work address by driving around town looking for my car in parking lots until she spotted it. She'd been stalking me, driving around looking for my car to figure out where I worked so she could ambush me at my job. I told her this was completely inappropriate and she needed to leave before I called the police. Patricia said she just needed to explain what Franklin was going through, how the stress was killing him, how he'd been having chest pains and couldn't sleep. She said he was too proud to call me himself, but that he wanted me to know he was sorry for how he'd reacted. She said losing the house would destroy him completely, that it was the only thing he had left that made him feel like a man. I said that if Franklin wanted to apologize, he could do it himself, not send her to my workplace to manipulate me with medical drama. Patricia said it wasn't manipulation, that Franklin really was struggling, but that he'd rather die than beg his son for help after what happened. She said I was the bigger person, the stronger one, the one who could choose to save the family instead of letting pride destroy everything. I told her that pride wasn't destroying the family. Poor choices were destroying the family. Treating people like garbage and then expecting them to come running back was destroying the family. Celebrating someone's departure and then acting shocked when they didn't return was destroying the family. Patricia said they'd all learned from what happened, that everyone realized they'd handled things wrong, but that families forgive each other and move forward together. I asked her if she'd forgiven me for allegedly being a burden and leeching off them for years. Patricia said that was just something Franklin said when he was angry, that nobody actually believed that. I asked her if she'd forgiven me for apparently owing them money for food and utilities. Patricia said that was just her being stressed about the foreclosure notice, that she wasn't thinking clearly. I asked her if she'd forgiven me for whatever William thought I'd done wrong when he dumped my clothes in trash bags. Patricia couldn't answer that one. She just kept saying that everyone had made mistakes, that everyone had said things they regretted, that the important thing was moving forward as a family. I told her that some mistakes were bigger than others, and that some things couldn't be unsaid or undone. I told her that the champagne really said everything I needed to know about how they felt about me, and that no amount of desperation was going to change that. Patricia started crying harder and said I was breaking her apart, that she couldn't choose between her husband and her son, that there had to be a way to fix this. I said she'd already chosen. They all had. That day when they threw me out and celebrated, they'd chosen to prioritize their anger and pride over family. Now they were just upset about the consequences of that choice. Security escorted Patricia out after she refused to leave on her own. The whole scene was humiliating and unprofessional, and I had to explain to my manager what was going on. Fortunately, he was understanding, but I shouldn't have to deal with family drama at my workplace. That was 6 days ago. Yesterday, I got an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from Franklin. And guys, this letter was something else. I'll break down the highlights in the next update because honestly, you need to see what this man thinks constitutes an apology and a reasonable request. But I'll give you a preview. He's not just asking for money anymore. He's got a whole business proposal. Update 2. Okay, Reddit. Buckle up because Franklin's letter was something else. I've read it probably 10 times now, and I'm still processing the absolute audacity of this man. Shout out to everyone who guessed he'd try to make it about business instead of family. You know toxic people way too well. But first, let me tell you what happened between Patricia's workplace ambush and the letter arriving, because the escalation was real. 2 days after security escorted Patricia out of my office building, I got a friend request on LinkedIn from William. LinkedIn. Like we're professional contacts or something. I declined it immediately, but then I started getting connection requests from profiles that looked fake, random names with no photos, minimal information, obviously created to try to reach me. I reported them all and changed my privacy settings. Then I found out they'd been asking around about me. My neighbor in my old apartment complex, Dario, texted me saying some woman had shown up asking questions about where I'd moved to. He described her, and it was definitely Patricia. She'd told him she was my mother and that there'd been a family emergency, that she needed to find me urgently, but I'd changed my number. Dario didn't give her any information, but the fact that she was literally going door to door looking for me was beyond creepy. I had to wonder how many other places she'd tried, how many people she'd bothered with her sob story. But here's what really got to me. She'd driven back to my old complex, which is a 40-minute drive from their house, to hunt for information about my current address. She'd spent gas money, they apparently didn't have to stalk me. That's dedication to manipulation right there. Meanwhile, William tried a different approach. He found my Instagram account and started liking and commenting on old photos. Nothing dramatic, just casual comments like, "Miss those days" and "good times" on pictures from family gatherings. When I didn't respond, he moved to Facebook and did the same thing there, just inserting himself back into my social media presence like nothing had happened. I blocked him on everything, but it was annoying because it meant I had to go through years of photos and memories deciding what to keep private and what to delete entirely. They were making me sanitize my own life to avoid their manipulation. That brings us to Franklin's letter. I'm going to break down the highlights because this thing was 6 pages of handwritten manipulation. disguised as a business proposal. It started with what he probably thought was a heartfelt apology. Franklin wrote about how he'd been doing a lot of thinking since I left, how he realized he'd handled everything wrong, how his pride and fear had made him say things he didn't mean. He talked about his injury and how losing his ability to provide for his family had damaged his sense of self-worth. He said seeing me step up to help had made him feel even more inadequate, even though he was grateful. So far, this actually sounded like progress. Like maybe he was starting to understand why his reaction had been so hurtful and disproportionate. But then it took a turn. Franklin wrote that he'd been talking to some people and doing research, and he'd realized that our family situation could actually be turned into an opportunity. See, there are all these programs and resources for families dealing with financial hardship, but you have to know how to work the system. Franklin had been learning about loan modification programs, hardship deferrals, even some state and federal assistance programs for disabled homeowners. The problem was, these programs worked best when you had someone with good credit and steady income involved in the application process, someone like me. Here's where it got really interesting. Franklin proposed that we could restructure everything as a business arrangement. I could buy the house from the bank at the foreclosure auction for probably 60 or 70% of what they owed on it. Then I could rent it back to them at whatever amount they could afford, maybe $500 or $600 a month to start. As their income improved with William working and Patricia getting more hours, we could increase the rent gradually. Meanwhile, Franklin would apply for a modification on his disability status that would allow him to do light consulting work in construction. He knew people in the industry who would pay him to review plans and job sites, stuff that wouldn't require physical labor but would bring in some income. Patricia was already talking to her manager about picking up shifts at other store locations. Within 2 or 3 years, Franklin estimated, they'd be able to buy the house back from me at the price I'd paid for it, plus some agreed-upon interest rate. I'd get my money back with profit, they'd get to keep their home, and the whole family would be stronger for having worked through this challenge together. Franklin wrote that this way, everyone wins. I get to be a real estate investor, they get to stay in their home, and we all move forward as a family without anyone having to swallow their pride or admit they were wrong. It would be business, not charity. The letter went on to explain that Franklin had already talked to a real estate agent who confirmed this kind of arrangement was legal and fairly common. He'd even gotten the contact information for a lawyer who specialized in family real estate transactions. All we needed to do was meet and work out the details. Franklin ended the letter by saying he knew I was hurt by what happened, but that this was a chance to turn a bad situation into something positive for everyone. He said he was proud of how I'd handled being on my own, that it showed I'd learned the independence and resilience he'd tried to teach me growing up. Now it was time to use those skills to help the family while also building my own future. I read this letter 3 times before the full scope of the manipulation sank in. First, Franklin had completely rewritten the history of what happened. In his version, I wasn't thrown out and celebrated as a burden being removed. I was a son who'd learned valuable life lessons and was now ready to step up as a business partner. The champagne celebration had been memory-holed entirely. Second, he'd found a way to ask for money that didn't sound like asking for money. Instead of begging me to bail them out, he was offering me an investment opportunity. Instead of admitting he needed help, he was positioning himself as someone doing me a favor by letting me in on this great deal. Third, and this was the most manipulative part, he'd structured it so that if I said no, I wasn't just refusing to help family, I was turning down a legitimate business opportunity. And if anyone criticized the arrangement later, he could say it was all my idea, that I was the one who bought their house and became their landlord. But the thing that really got to me was the timeline. Franklin expected that within 2 or 3 years, they'd have their lives together enough to buy the house back from me. This from people who couldn't manage their finances when I was contributing more than half their mortgage payment every month. This from William, who hadn't held a job for 3 years. This from Patricia, who worked part-time retail. Franklin honestly believed that I would invest $30,000 or $40,000 in buying their house, then rent it back to them for less than their current mortgage payment, while they figured out how to become financially responsible adults in their 50s and 20s respectively. And here's the kicker. If their plan didn't work out, if they couldn't buy the house back in 2 or 3 years, what then? I'd be stuck owning a house with tenants who used to be my family, trying to collect rent from people who'd already shown me exactly how they handle financial obligations and family relationships. I sat on the letter for 3 days trying to figure out how to respond. Part of me wanted to write back and explain point by point why this plan was ridiculous. Part of me wanted to ignore it entirely. Part of me was actually impressed by the creativity of turning a bailout request into a business proposal. But mostly, I was just sad. This letter showed me that Franklin had learned absolutely nothing from what happened. He still saw me as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. He'd just gotten more sophisticated about how he asked for what he wanted. So I decided to respond, but not the way he expected. I drove to their house last Saturday afternoon. I wanted to see the foreclosure sign for myself, and I wanted to have this conversation face to face so there could be no misunderstanding about where things stood. The driveway was empty, and the house looked abandoned. The grass was getting long, and there were newspapers piling up on the front step. I knocked on the door and waited. Patricia answered, and the look on her face when she saw me was a mixture of hope, relief, and guilt. She called for Franklin and William, and suddenly we were all standing in the living room that used to feel like home, having the conversation that would determine whether this family had any future together. Franklin started talking immediately about how glad he was that I'd come, how he knew I'd see the wisdom of his proposal, how we could go to the lawyer next week and start working out the details. I let him talk for a couple minutes. Then I told him I had some questions about his business plan. The conversation that followed was 2 hours of the most honest discussion this family had ever had about money, respect, and what we actually meant to each other. And guys, it did not go the way Franklin expected. I'll break down that conversation in my next update because what came out during those 2 hours changed everything. But I'll give you a preview. Turns out there were some things about their financial situation that none of them had told me. And when the truth came out, it explained a lot about why they'd been so desperate to get me back. The foreclosure was just the beginning of their problems. Final update. Reddit, this is it. The final chapter of this absolute mess. And honestly, after what came out during that conversation, I understand now why they were so desperate to get me back. It wasn't just about the mortgage. When I walked into that living room last Saturday, I had my questions ready. I'd spent 3 days thinking about Franklin's business proposal, and I wanted specific answers about how they planned to make this work. I started simple. I asked Franklin how he'd calculated that they could afford $500 or $600 in rent when they couldn't afford their current mortgage payment, even with my help. Franklin said they'd been paying extra toward principal for years, so the actual payment they needed to cover was lower than what I'd been contributing. Plus, with the modification programs he'd researched, they could get the interest rate reduced significantly. I asked him to show me the numbers. That's when things got interesting. Franklin went to get their financial paperwork, and while he was gone, Patricia started talking about how they'd learned to budget better, how they'd cut expenses, how they were committed to making this work. William jumped in with details about job interviews he'd supposedly lined up, places that were definitely going to hire him, income he'd have coming in within weeks. But when Franklin came back with the papers, I could see the problem immediately. These people had no idea what their actual financial situation was. Franklin showed me mortgage statements that were 3 months old. He had utility bills that were 2 payment cycles behind. He had credit card statements with minimum payments that were higher than he seemed to realize. I asked him about the credit cards. How much did they owe total? Franklin got defensive immediately. He said the credit cards weren't part of the house discussion, that they could handle those separately, that we just needed to focus on the mortgage modification and rental arrangement. I said I couldn't evaluate a business proposal without understanding their complete financial picture. That's when Patricia started crying and the whole truth came out. Turns out, when Franklin's injury happened 3 years ago, they didn't just lose his income, they also lost his health insurance. Franklin's medical bills and ongoing treatment costs had been eating them alive. They'd been putting everything on credit cards. Not just medical expenses, but groceries, utilities, car repairs, everything. When I started helping with the mortgage, it freed up money that immediately went to credit card payments. But they were only making minimum payments on balances that kept growing because they were still using the cards for basic living expenses. William had been telling them for 2 years that he was on the verge of getting hired somewhere, that he just needed a little more time. So they'd been floating his expenses too, waiting for his contribution that never materialized. Patricia's part-time job barely covered her gas and car payment. She'd been telling them she could get more hours, but the reality was that her store was cutting hours, not adding them. By the time I moved out, they had over $40,000 in credit card debt spread across 8 different cards. The minimum payments alone were nearly $1,500 a month. The mortgage was just the most visible part of their financial collapse. I asked why they hadn't told me about any of this when I was helping them. Franklin said it wasn't my responsibility, that they were handling it, that they didn't want to burden me with more than I was already doing. I pointed out that if I'd known about the credit card debt, I might have been able to help them come up with a real plan instead of just enabling them to dig the hole deeper. William said they hadn't wanted me to think they were irresponsible with money. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. Here they were, asking me to invest $40,000 in buying their house and renting it back to them, while sitting on $40,000 in credit card debt they'd hidden from me for 2 years. Franklin said the credit card debt was separate from the house issue, that they could deal with it after we got the house situation resolved. I asked him how they planned to deal with $1,500 a month in minimum credit card payments while paying me rent and buying groceries and keeping the utilities on. Franklin said they'd figure it out, that the important thing was keeping the house. I asked Patricia if she really thought she could get enough additional hours to contribute meaningfully to this plan. Patricia admitted that her store was actually closing in 6 months, that she'd known for 2 weeks but hadn't told Franklin and William yet because she didn't want to add to their stress. I asked William about these job interviews he'd mentioned. William said he'd been networking and exploring opportunities, that something would come through soon, that he just needed a little more time to find the right fit. I asked him how many actual interviews he'd been on in the past month. William said it wasn't about the number of interviews. It was about finding quality opportunities that matched his skills and interests. I asked him to give me a number. William finally admitted he hadn't been on any actual interviews, but he'd been researching companies and preparing applications. So let me summarize what I learned. Franklin wanted me to buy their house and rent it back to them based on a business plan that assumed Patricia would get more hours at a job that was closing. William would find employment after 3 years of not seriously looking, and they'd somehow pay off $40,000 in credit card debt while paying me rent on a budget that already didn't work. And they'd hidden the true scope of their financial problems from me for 2 years while I was contributing to their mortgage, letting me think I was helping them stay afloat when actually, I was helping them drown more slowly. I told them I needed to understand something. I asked why they'd thrown me out so aggressively when I lost my job, if they knew they couldn't survive without my help. Franklin said they'd been scared and reacted emotionally, that they hadn't thought through the consequences. I asked why they'd celebrated with champagne if they knew they needed me. Patricia said they weren't really celebrating me leaving. They were trying to convince themselves they'd be fine, trying to make Franklin feel better about what had happened. I asked William why he'd thrown my clothes in trash bags and told me not to ask for help when I was starving, if they knew they'd need to ask for my help within weeks. William said he'd been supporting Franklin in the moment, that families sometimes say things they don't mean when emotions are high. Then I asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. I asked them if they'd ever actually seen me as family, or if they'd always seen me as a resource to be managed. The silence in that room was deafening. Finally, Franklin said that of course I was family, that everything they'd done was because they loved me and wanted what was best for everyone. I asked him if throwing my laptop across the room was what was best for me. Franklin said he'd been angry and frustrated, that he was sorry it had happened. I asked him if emptying my wallet was what was best for me. Patricia said she'd panicked about money and reacted badly. I asked them if celebrating my departure with champagne was what was best for me. None of them could answer that. I told them I finally understood what had happened. They'd needed my money but resented needing it. They'd been grateful for my help but bitter about requiring it. When I lost my job, they'd seen an opportunity to blame me for their problems and make themselves feel better by pushing me away. But they'd never actually planned to survive without me. They'd just been angry and wanted to hurt me. And they'd assumed I'd come crawling back when I realized how hard life was on my own. The champagne wasn't about being glad I was gone. It was about proving to themselves that they were strong enough to reject me, even though they knew they weren't. Franklin tried to argue, but I wasn't finished. I told them that their business proposal proved they still saw me as a resource, rather than a person. They weren't offering me an investment opportunity. They were trying to manipulate me into becoming their landlord so they could stay in a house they couldn't afford while making payments they couldn't sustain to cover debts they'd hidden from me. I said if they'd come to me 6 months ago with honesty about their situation, we might have worked together on a real solution. If they'd treated me with respect when I lost my job, we might have figured out a temporary plan together. But they'd chosen manipulation over honesty, celebration over support, and blame over responsibility. Now they wanted me to rescue them from the consequences of those choices by pretending this was a business arrangement instead of what it really was, a bailout with extra steps. William started talking about family loyalty and second chances, but I cut him off. I told them I'd learned something important over the past few months. I'd learned that I was happier and more successful without people in my life who saw me as a means to an end. I'd learned that I could build relationships based on mutual respect instead of financial obligation. I'd learned that I didn't need their approval or acceptance to have a good life. Most importantly, I'd learned that the champagne celebration had been the most honest moment in our relationship because it showed me exactly how they felt when they thought they didn't need me anymore. Patricia started crying and asking what they were supposed to do now, where they were supposed to go, how they were supposed to survive. I told them they were supposed to figure it out the same way they'd expected me to figure it out when they threw me out with trash bags and $40. Franklin said I was being cruel, that I was abandoning family when they needed me most. I said they'd abandoned me first. that they'd chosen to prioritize their pride and anger over family when they celebrated my departure. William said this was different, that they were facing homelessness while I had a good job and a nice apartment. I said the difference was that I'd earned my job and apartment by working and being responsible, while they'd created their situation by hiding debt, avoiding work, and making financial decisions based on fantasy rather than reality. I told them that if they wanted help, they could start by being honest with each other about their real situation, getting William into actual job training or employment assistance, and finding Patricia a new job before her current one disappeared. But I wasn't going to be part of another plan based on wishful thinking and hidden information. I said I was done being the solution to problems they wouldn't acknowledge and the scapegoat for consequences they wouldn't accept. Then I left. That was 4 days ago. I haven't heard from any of them since, which is honestly a relief. Yesterday, I drove past the house again. The foreclosure sign is still there, but I noticed someone had been cutting the grass. Maybe they found somewhere else to live. Maybe they're staying there until the end. I don't know. What I do know is that I'm sleeping better than I have in months. I'm not checking my phone constantly waiting for the next manipulation attempt. I'm not second-guessing my decisions or wondering if I'm being too harsh. For the first time in years, I'm not responsible for other people's poor choices or required to fix situations I didn't create. Reddit. I know some of you will think I was too harsh, that families should forgive each other, that I should have helped them one more time. But here's what I learned. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's dysfunction. Sometimes the kindest choice is to let people face the consequences of their actions instead of protecting them from reality. My family showed me who they really were when they thought they didn't need me. Now they get to live with the consequences of being those people. And I get to live my life surrounded by people who value me for who I am, not what I can provide. The champagne celebration taught me everything I needed to know. I'm just sorry it took me so long to believe what they showed me. Thanks for listening, Reddit. This has been therapeutic as hell to write out.